How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Our nation's dependence on fossil fuels has led to climate disruption and inequality. Underserved communities are the ones most harmed by pollution, lack of green space, and heat-related illness. Will those communities fare better in a green economy? What does a just transition to renewable power look like? We'll discuss that on Climate One today with Kevin de León, former president of the California State Senate, Darryl Molina Sarmiento, executive director of Communities for a Better Environment, and Vien Truong, an advocate for climate justice. In the second half of our show, Climate One honors Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice and the recipient of the annual Stephen Schneider Award for outstanding climate science communication, delivering the message of climate change. Next on Climate One. Vien Truong, you were born in a refugee camp, saw your first murder as a child. Tell us how your life story and briefly, and then pointed to the work you're doing right now on climate justice.
Yeah, my family and I are refugees from Vietnam. We're part of the boat people migration. And when we got here, we went to work on farmlands in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, where we picked strawberries and snow peas. My mom would strap me to her back. When my grandma started getting dementia, we moved to Oakland, California, so that we had family members who can watch her when they were at work. And my parents, who never spoke English, the only jobs they could find in Oakland was in sweatshops. We would call them garment factories. And they would work from morning to night, 25 cents a shirt. That's what they did from the time I was 3 until the time I went to college. And this was growing up in Oakland, California during the 80s. It was the crack years, as they would be called now. I saw my first murder when I was 8. And growing up in these conditions, now when I think about a just transition for the country, I think about people who grew up on farmlands, farmers and farm workers. I think about people who live in communities that are blighted, underserved, and neglected for generations. I think about the lack of resources for people who are in low-wage, low-road jobs, and how do we help make sure that we are transitioning them so that no one is left behind, no worker is left behind, and that we can actually create a high roads, high dignity, sustainable future for all.
What a story. I'm moved by that story. I've heard it several times. I'm still moved by your story, Vien. Darryl Molina Sarmiento, you were 18 years old and you went on a toxic tour in southeast Los Angeles, a poor part of Los Angeles. Tell us how that kind of pointed you in the direction you're going now.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I participated in my first Communities for a Better Environment toxic tour when I was a student in college, and we toured Southeast Los Angeles and saw some of the most toxic polluters in the country. And that is when I realized that what's happening in Southeast Los Angeles and what's happening all across the United States is really similar to what's happening where my family is from in the Philippines. And so making those global connections to what's happening in Southeast LA to my own personal background and history is what really brought me to do this work and to do it with Communities for a Better Environment. And so I started off as our youth program coordinator, and that is where I worked with our youth members to push back against the construction of a 943 megawatt power plant in Southeast Los Angeles, less than a mile from hundreds of homes and schools. And then I became our Southern California program director soon after that, and eventually, 14 years later, I'm here as our executive director, the first woman of color in the organization's history that started off, from 18 years old as a participant in our toxic tour. So I feel really privileged to be able to be here and do this work.
Fabulous. Kevin de León, you're not a traditional environmentalist. You said that when you became president of the California State Senate, you didn't call Tom Steyer or the head of Sierra Club. You had a very different background than that traditional environmentalist. Tell us how environmentalism got into your priorities in your life.
Thanks, Zach. First and foremost, Greg, and to each and every one of you. I grew up in Tijuana, in San Diego, on both sides of the border. Youngest child, single immigrant mother, third grade education. My mother had the courage of her conviction to cross a border to seek a better life for myself and for my two sisters. My mother was a housekeeper, so she cleaned homes in a very wealthy enclave in San Diego called La Jolla, California. The large, mansions on top of the hill with the ocean panoramic views, and it was there that I learned the value of hard work. And my mother's very strong work ethic, but at the same time, the ability, even at a very young age, sort of to contrast between the haves and have-nots. Beautiful open space, beautiful green grass, trees for canopy, for shade, the beaches. And where I grew up in a neighborhood called Logan Heights, it was cement and concrete and asphalt and a dearth of trees, so there's no trees for shade. And growing up and being able to sort of critically analyze a little better why this was the case. Obviously, politicians, elected officials at the local, state, federal level, planning commissioners. I'm very same with Darryl and with Vien too, made certain decisions. We're going to put junkyards here or chrome plating facility plants there, and we're not going to build parks here, and we're going to build parks in these other communities, and bike paths and trails for walking. So obviously, for me, it became a human and civil rights issue, and I think that's what sort of gave me that passion when given an opportunity to be in a position with a vast amount of political power and try to bring about equitable, justice in the greatest state in the country, California.
Kevin de León, what's your idea of a just transition? It's a term that's used quite, it means, different things to different people. What's your conception of a just transition?
Well, a couple things. One is we clearly have to decarbonize our economy. We have no other choice. The scientists have already spoken loud and clear. This is a political issue. It's not a scientific issue. We have all the empirical evidence that clearly suggests that we're on a pathway to a lot of bad stuff is going to happen. It's already happening right now in real time. Right in California, we have the droughts, we have extreme weather patterns. We had a historic drought for 5 years, and we went from a historic drought from 5 years to a record amount of rainfall in recorded history in California. So those are extreme weather patterns, and that's not a good thing.
Houston had 3 500-year floods in 3 years in a row.
Exactly. So we know it's happening right now in real time. So for me, we have no choice. We have to decarbonize our economy. So a just transition. For those folks who are working in the extractive, industries, who are working in refineries, whether it's in Richmond, California, Martinez, Benicia, or down in Southern California, Torrance, or for that matter, any other place in the country, in Texas and Houston, which is the capital of refineries, we have to make sure that we can transition these folks to a clean energy economy, making sure that their salaries, their wages, their benefits are commensurate with what they're actually, receiving right now. For those who have been historically and socioeconomically marginalized for a whole variety of issues, due to ethnicity, due to immigration status, due to their zip code, we have to make sure that we can provide a good paying job with good benefits in the clean energy space. And the one thing that we've done here in California is, to date, we have created 500,000 jobs in the clean energy space. Now, I want to put this in context because that is 10 times more jobs in the clean energy space in California than there are coal mining jobs in all of America.
Vien Truong, you were very close with Van Jones 10 years ago. Green jobs were going to be this great promise. A lot of that didn't really pan out. A lot of the ambition and aspirations of green jobs didn't pan out. I'd like to get your thoughts on the reality of green jobs. Is it going to be different this time, that they're going to really realize their potential?
Well, we just heard from Senator de León talk about the 500,000 green jobs that were created. And
I'm wondering if that includes people who drive a natural gas bus, or because there's some dispute about what's counted as a green job. So that acknowledged there's lots of green jobs, but.
What we never promised is that it was going to get done in 4 years. So let me say that the move towards a green new future is something that we have to continue to walk down the path of. And we don't really have a choice, right? We now know it's one of the biggest global national security problems that we are facing. Syria, it was a war fought over scarce resources. The rural communities were drying up and farmers had to go to the city center, pushing more pressure on the lack of resources that was already happening in the city center. Now half the people that are at the borders being detained in the United States are there because of their work in agriculture in their home countries are no longer in existence. And they're forced here because of lack of ability to survive and to care for their families. This is not an issue of whether or not we can transition, we have to. The climate is already changing and we have to change along with it. We have to make sure that we're doing it in such a way that is bringing people along so that we're not leaving folks behind because there is no other choice. I will say that forces us to think differently about this creation of a new economy. It is not just about creating jobs, which is important. And we have to make sure that we're thinking about the jobs and the industries that we're creating, make sure that they are sustainable and green and not gray, not killing people. We have to make sure that we're creating a workforce pipeline to prepare people for those jobs. And we have to make sure that we're treating people differently in this transition as well.
Darryl Molina Sarmiento, there's a Green New Deal in Los Angeles, so there are Green New Deals at the state and city level. Is that is that progressive? Is that LA is the kind of the car capital of the country? Is the Green New Deal there a real thing?
Yes, the Green New Deal is a real thing. There, like folks have said, there are so many different aspects to the Green New Deal. The one part of the Green New Deal in Los Angeles is not repowering 3 major power plants in the city of Los Angeles. However, it is really a complex conversation because, how do you make sure that the labor movement is included in all of these conversations along with community and the government and environmental justice and indigenous concerns. And so I think there are a lot of challenges to ensuring that the Green New Deal is informed and led by the work that has been done for generations and for many years by frontline environmental and indigenous organizations.
Often described as the father of environmental justice, Dr. Robert Bullard has written several seminal books on the topic. He's known for his work highlighting pollution on minority communities and speaking up against environmental racism in the 1970s and 80s. The $15,000 Schneider Award was established in honor of the late Stephen Schneider, a Stanford professor and one of the founding fathers of climatology. The award recognizes a natural or social scientist who has made extraordinary scientific contributions and communicated that knowledge to a broad public in a clear, compelling fashion. Dr. Bullard is joined by Adrianna Quintero, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Energy Foundation. They say the conversation about dumping fossil fuels needs to be more inclusive and fair. You grew up in Elba, Alabama, about 80 miles south of Montgomery, a region that gave rise to the civil rights movement, of course, Rosa Parks in Montgomery. So tell us about the connection between kind of you growing up in the very fertile region of the civil rights movement and getting it, and then how that connects to your work with environmental justice.
Well, I grew up in an era where everything was segregated in the South. I went to an all-black elementary school, middle school, high school. I never had a white teacher until I went to Iowa State University, worked on a PhD. My undergraduate university was all black, Alabama A&M University. So I grew up in an era where civil rights and fighting for justice was the same in voting and young people and students. I was part of that, that student movement, and so my parents and grandparents, they were strong supporters of voting. Now, I didn't see myself, growing up as an environmentalist, but in terms of growing up where having gardens and having this whole idea of not wasting things and being creative with the little that you have. I didn't grow up, quote, impoverished or anything. We had a little money because my great-grandparents actually was able to get 550 acres of timberland in 10 years after slavery. We don't know how they got it, but we know they got it. And that's how my parents were able to sell the timber every 6 or 7 years to send all my siblings to college. And so I was very aware of the environment in terms of outdoors and and trees and nature, but it was not, I guess, rooted in this whole idea of modern environmentalism.
But for you, that those logging was a source of advancement. I'm just curious about that. Having logging actually put you through school. The connection there between trees as a source of revenue versus balancing them for some environmental purpose.
Yeah, and the whole idea of being outdoors. My dad hunted and fished. He was a member of, I won't call the name, that they've named an award after. We couldn't join, black folks couldn't join the Sierra Club. It was in Alabama, it was a private club. But he hunted, fished.
Did not know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Jim Crow, there's a reason they call the South Dixie. But again, the idea of being outdoors and having rivers that were clean and pristine, and because my parents, my dad mostly fished, he was not an angler. It wasn't catch and release. It was catch and bring home, clean and eat. And so that idea was all instilled.
You're receiving the Stephen Schneider Award for Climate Communication. Stephen Schneider was a fearless communicator. He was in the natural sciences, had a unique understanding. He talked to economists and social scientists, cross-disciplinary communication, which was fairly rare in the climate world back then. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on the importance of kind of communicating the science and sociology and kind of the different disciplines speaking about climate, which is seen kind of as a atmospheric, faraway issue. At least it has been.
I think the idea of climate change and this whole issue of the science and how we communicate that science, and to expand what it means when we talk about a climate crisis, a global warming, a climate change, that climate change has to be defined more than parts per million and more than greenhouse gases. When we talk about communities that are on the front line, we talk about the most impacted. We talk about the economic consequences, and we talk about the health effects. We talk about the whole idea of communities that will somehow culturally disappear. And when we define and communicate that outward, then we have more people that will come to the table and say, "Oh, I understand what you're talking about. I am, we don't ask people to believe. It's not a belief. It's like asking people, do you believe in gravity? Jump off a 12-story building." So when we talk about communicating, the issues, I think we have to be multilingual when it comes to different disciplines. I've written 18 books on transportation, housing, on food security, on disasters, and they got catchy titles, but it's 18 books, but it's just one book. Don't tell anybody, but it's the thing that holds those books together is fairness, justice, and equity.
We're going to invite Adrianna Quintero to come up and join us. We're going to bring another seat up here for her and ask her to join the conversation. Adrianna is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Energy Foundation, which distributes about $100 million in grants a year. She's a friend of Climate One, so please welcome Adrianna.
Thank you.
So Adrianna, you were working at a large environmental organization on litigation, and at some point you felt kind of uncomfortable with the inclusiveness of that large organization. So tell us about how you felt like you weren't quite treated as an equal there and what you did about it.
Yeah, well, when I started in the movement, I started as an attorney and pretty quickly realized we were working on pesticides litigation. And so it was very obvious to me that there should be some Latino farm workers represented in these cases. And while they were referenced and we were talking about them, we weren't talking to them. There was not that connection, at least in what, and we were doing the litigation. So for me, that was a clear disconnect and something that needed to be addressed. Fortunately, I was working with a really amazing lawyer who's very committed to environmental justice to this day, and he just basically said, "You're right, let's go do it. Let's go and start figuring this out." And that began my journey to try and to really learn. I had to educate myself. I did not come to this work knowing all the history and the wonderful work that people like Dr. Bullard had done and the environmental justice movement had done. So for me, it was really a learning journey to see and try and make sense of the disconnect, which to this day, I have trouble understanding how we got there, how we got here, how we got to the point where the environmental movement really lost touch with the humanity and the communities that were most impacted. And it just continues to motivate me every day.
The Green New Deal is this aspirational thing that's out there that a lot of people probably couldn't quite define, but it stirred quite a debate. And I think that the inclusion of some of the justice and economic issues that Dr. Bullard's talking about scares some liberals. It makes them uncomfortable because they think they're going to lose some of their privilege, some of their wealth. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. I think that's why it stirred so much debate. The Green New Deal came on the scene with a big bang because of the intersectionality that it presented. And it really brought to light the reality that we can no longer think of the environment as one bucket that just sits alone in this silo. No, it has to do with transportation, it has to do with housing, it has to do with jobs, it has to do with health. All of these things are tied directly to our environment, to where we live, to our opportunities. And there is absolutely no threat to thinking of it that way. That's actually how we break this logjam that we've had, and frankly, take the energy out of the others who debate whether or not environmentalism is something that's important. When we start to show the connection to every single part of our lives, it's undeniable. So anyone who is nervous about this particular piece of legislation just needs to look at how it's energized the conversation. It has sparked debate like no other piece of policy has, at least in my lifetime in this movement. And I think that is where we need to be. We need to start talking about solutions that actually benefit everybody and benefit all the aspects of our lives. Because if we continue to silo environment, we're going to lose a lot of people, and it's just not realistic. And the people who are going to be most impacted are communities of color. By every single time we've looked at it, the support that exists for climate policies, the awareness of the fact that climate change is happening is so much higher among communities of color.
Dr. Bullard, a lot of the, quote, mainstream environmental efforts have been funded by people who basically want to keep the economic and class structure in place, and they're worried that their house in the woods might burn down or their house on the ocean might get flooded, and they want to keep things the same and kind of swap out fossils for clean, but they don't want to tackle some of these deeper racial and structural issues. Is that fair?
Yes. Yeah, the long and short of it is that I think the time has passed for tinkering and around the edges. The fact that we are facing a threat in terms of climate change and global warming that it will call for bold action and bold decisions that will need to be made across the board, and economic, political, in terms of our transportation systems, and in terms of our energy systems, in terms of our housing, in terms of land use planning, in terms of all those things coming together. So it's not just, when we talk about solutions, you just can't have, a few policymakers sitting in a room who've all been trained in one little area, who went to the same school, who may not understand anything what's going on the ground in a community where they've flown over it, 30,000 feet, and at 30,000 feet, everything looks small, looks great, You can't see the granular kind of thing. So we need to really think through this whole idea of keeping things as they are. Right now in Houston, Texas, fourth largest city in the country, only major city that doesn't have zoning, we're fighting like hell to make sure that the recovery does not, post-Harvey recovery, does not reproduce the pre-Harvey inequality. We don't want to rebuild on inequality and make it like it was, because like it was unequal. It took a biblical flood to get environmental groups, mostly white groups in Houston, to come together with groups of environmental justice groups, of faith-based groups, groups working on transportation and food security, et cetera, to come together. When you don't protect the least in your society, you place everybody at risk.
That's right.
And so our thing is justice will say, let's do fairness, equity, and justice to make sure that we do not somehow say just because you live in a low-income neighborhood that you don't deserve to have a park, a grocery store, and flood mitigation and flood protection. You don't deserve to have access to transportation. We say that's the equity part. That's the justice part that we build into a climate resilience plan, a sustainability plan, and a housing affordability plan. All of that. And some people say, well, that's not dealing with the problem of flooding. Well, it's flooding plus. Flooding plus. All the pollution chemical companies located on one side. And they're dealing with flooding of the on that side, but they're also dealing with chemical releases. Let's deal with the whole picture and not just somehow, just because your neighborhood flooded for the first time, now you just want to deal with one issue. The justice framing and the equity lens will say we need to address those legacy issues that somehow got swept under the rug or got somehow wiped off of the slate of policy. And that's what we're fighting for right now. And for someone who has tenure, I'm not shy. I'm not timid. And at my age, I don't care what people say.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you podcast. Please help us keep up the conversation going by giving us a rating or review. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, everybody.